Welcome to this section where we'll be talking about standard and custom objects. Standard and custom objects are quite important for you to consider when you're taking the administration exam, primarily because it comprises 18% of the total grade, if you will. I'm going to be going into quite a few details in this particular lecture, and I encourage you to have a pen and paper ready and jot down some of the questions you might have. Later on in this course, we're going to be doing a practice quiz. And while we go through this particular lecture, I'll be pointing out some of the key things that you'll need to note when studying for this exam. All right, let's dive into it. So a standard object, the key thing to know about Salesforce is that it organizes the information in what we call objects, right? And the architecture of Salesforce is that depending on, if you can imagine, it's like a house, and each house has a series of rooms in it. Okay, so Salesforce is like a huge house, and objects are those rooms, and inside those rooms you have different functions. So, for example, the kitchen might have a stove, it might have a kitchen table, it might have knives and forks in it. And so each object has different pieces attached to it. Now, some rooms are connected to other rooms. In other words, there can be doors that you can walk from one room to the other. Okay? And so there's sometimes relationships between objects. And what I'm going to talk about is the difference between standard and custom objects and the relationships between all of these things. But I want you to keep this idea of a house in your mind. Salesforce is a house, and each object is the room in that house. Okay, and each room has a relationship with other rooms in the house. All right, so just keep that analogy in mind as we go through. All right, so let's dive into the slide. There are different types of relationships between objects in Salesforce. Their differences include how they handle data deletion, sharing, and required fields in page layouts. Very key question. Star this. This is going to be a very, very important thing for you to note when you're studying for this exam, because it's going to ask you the differences between the different objects, right? It's going to ask you whether data deletion is something for you to consider when knowing the differences between objects, right? So really star these. There are two types of objects. We have master detail and lookup, all right? So I'm going to explain the difference between the two. Master detail is the type of relationship closely links objects together such that the master record controls certain behaviors of the detail and sub-detail record. Okay? So when you think about a master detail, think about how one object, anything that happens to that one object affects everything underneath it. And I'm going to show you a visual in a second about what this looks like. So if you are not 100% sure, stick with me. I'm going to give you some of the content and then I'll show you a visual of this. Custom objects on the detail side of a master detail relationship can't have sharing rules, manual sharing, or queues as those require the owner field. Please make a star next to this particular point. Custom objects on the detail side of a master detail relationship can't have sharing rules, manual sharing, or queues, as these require the owner field. So classic question is, without an owner field, can the following be shared? All right, so that's some of the questions, and you'll say no, because they require an owner field for sharing rules, manual sharing, and queues to apply. Okay, great. The security settings for the master record control the details and sub-detail records. So for example, if you have profile settings that limit your ability to see a master object, right? So let's say, for example, you're not able to see the marketing object because you may be a operations person. That also means that you will not be able to see the sub-details in that record. So not only will you not be able to see the marketing object, but you won't be able to see any fields related to the marketing object, if that's how the security settings are set up, okay? As a best practice, don't exceed 10,000 child records for a master detail relationship. Okay, so that just might be something that pops up in the test. All right, lookup. Lookup relationships are similar, except they do not support sharing or roll-up summary fields. So what this means is that a lookup object is sort of like something that shows you something else. So you can, with master detail, if you make a change at the top, it will change everything following it. But a lookup relationship doesn't have that function. It doesn't roll up things, okay? You can link an object with itself, with the exception of the user object, okay? You can't delete an object or record in a lookup relationship if the combined number of records between the two linked object is more than 100,000, okay? So this is some small little fact that might pop up in the exam, but let me show you a visual of this, okay? So a master detail relationship is like a chain, all right? And each of these pieces are linked to one another. All right, so if you change anything at the top, the rest of the links will break. But a lookup detail, on the other hand, has two separate objects. So if you can imagine two chains hanging from a ceiling, for example, and the lookup relationship is a horizontal relationship. It's not a vertical relationship. So if you change one, it doesn't affect the entire structure of the two objects, right? Whereas a master detail object is very, very affected by the relationships between these. So if this was a master detail relationship, if I cut this chain, all the rest of these links would fall. But this is a lookup relationship with two separate objects. Okay. All right. So anything with a magnifying glass is either a lookup or master detail. So that's something that you'll notice in Salesforce when you're looking up a field. You can select using the magnifying glass, and that will tell you whether this is a lookup or master detail record. Okay. So, explain how to create, delete, and customize fields, page layouts, and list views for custom and standard objects. So custom settings are similar to custom objects, right? We use custom settings to create and manage custom data at the organization, profile, and user levels. Custom settings data is stored in the application cache, and this means you can access it efficiently without the cost of repeated queries, and the allowed limit is 2 megabytes. All right, great. So one of the things that Salesforce in the exam will ask you is about new page layouts. And one of the things that it will talk about is whether you can clone page layouts, right? So in the enhanced page layout editor, you can click edit next to a layout and then click save as on the layouts page, and that allows you to actually clone the layout. Now remember, when you clone a layout page, any changes you make on the original will not reflect on the new page because it's a copy and not a linked field or workflow, right? So in the original page layout editor, select a layout and then click clone on the layouts page. I'll show you a little bit about that when we actually do the demonstration. So given a scenario, determine the appropriate record types and business processes for custom and standard objects. Okay. Record types allow you to specify categories of records that display different pick list values and page layouts. Please highlight. In the exam, they may ask you to specify the kind of categories, right, or what a record type does. So you'll have to say that this record type specifies categories and displays different pick list values and page layouts. The key thing to think about in relation to a record type is the type of record type that you are dealing with. So in the example on the page, so you have IT positions and non-IT positions. These are separate page layouts. So each record type has its own page layout. So when we talk about ownership, for example, we're not talking about ownership of, let's say, when someone says, I own this event or I own a certain call or email. In Salesforce, you could say something like contact owner is. What that means is the owner of the record. And so we have different record types, and by using record types, you're able to really streamline your data. Let me give you an example of where this would be helpful. So in the instance where you have someone who is both perhaps the CEO of an organization, but they may sit on the board of a fundraising nonprofit. And so they may have a non-profit record, and they may have a sales record or a customer record, okay? And what that means is that when you're searching for this person, although they come up twice in Salesforce, they have two different functions, two different record types. And that helps us when we're thinking about sales to approach this person from the sales perspective, or when we're thinking about, for example, raising money or including them in some kind of event, we could use that record type. And so that's the importance of record types. But let's talk about the implications of deleting fields, right? When you delete a custom field, all of the field history is deleted and changes are no longer tracked. Deleting a custom field is stored until your organization permanently deletes it, or 45 days has elapsed, whichever comes first. This will be in the exam for sure, okay? However, the field still counts against the maximum number of custom fields allowed in your organization. So that's part of the addition that you have in Salesforce. And so if you have reached your maximum number of fields, you're trying to create a new one, you delete a field, Salesforce will still not allow you to create that field that you want to, because it'll say that you've reached your maximum. So what you actually have to do is go into your recyclable and delete it forever. Once you delete it forever, then Salesforce will give you the space to then put in your new field that you're looking for. Okay? Wonderful. So describe when to use and how to create formula fields. The first thing to know about formula fields is that Salesforce rounds up. All right? So that's important. When you're building cross-object formulas, this is really important. So in order for you to relate objects, right, and reference merge fields, it's important for you to build cross-object formulas. Once again, please star this particular point, because Salesforce is going to ask you about this. They're going to say, all right, so how would you span to related objects and reference merge fields? And one of the options is going to be to build a cross-object formula. So that's what you would do right here, all right? Formulas on activities that use standard fields shouldn't be placed on both the tasks and event pages, because tasks and events are under the activities object, right? So you've got to figure out where this field is related to, what object the field is related to. And sometimes, if they're in the same object, right, you can't put them on both of those pages because they're on the activities object, okay? So default value formulas for a type of record can only reference fields for that type of record. Okay, that's the default setting. However, you can use formula fields and formulas for things such as workflows, validations, assignments, escalations, for those kind of things, so that you can look up things. So let me make this very simple, right? Let me make this point very, very simple for you. It's in quite jargonish language. When you're thinking about a specific field, know that the default value formula can only reference fields for that type of record. So if it's a contact record, the default is that you will only be able to use fields in that default contact record type, okay? However, you can use formulas and custom formulas to pull information from lookup and master detail relationships. Let me make an example of this. We know in activities that tasks are one of the fields in that object, in the activities object. And we know that contacts is in and of itself, contacts or leads are itself an object. However, the contacts are engaging in events, are engaging in tasks. And so it's necessary often to pull information from the activities object into the contacts object using a formula, right? Or a validation. So when you've had X amount of tasks completed, that should update on the contact page or the leads page, right? So this is how you use workflows, data validation, and formulas to link the objects, right? And that's what this page is basically talking about. And that's what this page is basically talking about. So let's summarize. We have custom and standard objects, right? Custom and standard objects help us manage our organizing and think about the information and where it is. The key things for you to know is that when you're thinking about these pieces, that master detail and lookup relationships are very, very important. Okay? And finally, when you're thinking about fields, you need to think about whether this is a custom field or a standard field, and how those fields can relate to each other. And that's going to be the crux of what Salesforce is going to ask you. It's going to ask you about the master detail relationships, the lookup relationships, and it's going to ask you about fields, and filling in the dots in between all of those pieces are some of the elements that I ask you to highlight. So those are the key things to take away from this particular lecture.